Hello and welcome to this DW Business Special, looking at the economic implications of the coup in Niger, not just for Niger itself, but for the rest of the world. I'm Rob Watts, and I'm pleased to say that I'm joined by Alex Vines, who leads the Africa programme at the Policy Institute, Chatham House. Thank you so much for being here with us. Is there a real danger here that one of the world's poorest countries is about to get even poorer?
There is a real danger. I mean, over 40% of Nigerians already, before this coup, lived in absolute poverty. The academic work on coups in West Africa, the UNDP has just completed a really excellent study. And it shows that economies contract. It looked at previous coups in Mali and Guinea and shows a significant economic contraction. And so I'm very worried for Niger. It's not good news for its economy and for economic growth.
Yeah, and that's one of the things we'll, of course, do is put it all in context of the growing number of coups that there have been in the region just in the past 3 years or so. But before we get deeper into all of that, let's just take a look at the situation in Niger right now. So since military leaders have seized control of the Western African country in late July, Niger's streets have seen protests against France's influence there. Meanwhile, neighbouring countries and Western nations have called for the immediate restoration of the elected government. In a further development as well, there have been electricity blackouts in major cities in Niger after Nigeria cut off energy supplies as part of sanctions. Now, Niger is ranked as one of the very poorest countries in the world. Its economy is largely based around agriculture, subsistence farming, etc. It's a big recipient of international aid, some $2 billion per year. And another key aspect of its economy, of course, is that particularly from an international perspective, it's a key supplier of the world's uranium, the seventh biggest supplier, in fact. So Alex Vines from Chatham House. Niger is a big recipient of international aid, as I just said, and countries like the US have indicated that that could dry up unless democracy is restored. Can Niger cope without it?
No, as you've said, it's really dependent on international development. It's not just the United States that will hold a lot of it, suspend it. It's also the EU, it's other Western partners. And there's a raft of sanctions now been imposed on Niger by the Regional Economic Community body, the Ecowas. And so the screw is really being turned on the junta leaders in Niamey at the moment. Let alone, as you say, you've already mentioned, there's been a cut of energy supply from Nigeria to Niger.
Yeah, the US Secretary of State did say that money from hundreds of millions of dollars from the US is at jeopardy because of what's going on. So how does the junta stay in power if the country requires that money so much?
Yeah, so the junta initially said that all existing relationships would be respected, and that was what it announced over a week ago when it staged the coup. But, for example, today it said that it's scrapping its defence agreement with France, and it's kind of suggesting that it will chart a different course. To be honest, the junta really doesn't have a lot of choices here. It is really under pressure, and I think we've seen this in that the junta leader, General Sisani, last night was saying that actually the junta is only in power for a very short period of time, pending a transition process to democratic elections. So I think this is a reflection of the pressure that has built up very, very quickly on it.
Yeah, it's all very well for the junta to say that they want to maintain all relations, but it takes two to tango in each of those relationships, doesn't it? Let's also talk about what Niger offers to the rest of the world, which I think is important to discuss. And one of the reasons why it does get so much money from other countries, you obviously have the anti-Islamism security implications. But let's talk about uranium, because as we mentioned earlier, that it is a key source of that for the rest of the world. I mean, how important is that to the rest of the world?
So, as you mentioned already, it is the seventh largest producer of uranium, which equals 5% of global supply. So last year it produced about 2,020 tons of uranium. Now, it's got really impressive uranium reserves. That's absolutely clear, although it's been more costly to produce uranium. Much of the uranium that's exported from Niger goes to the EU. So it's the fifth largest source of supply for the European Union, and it does represent about 15% of consumption of uranium for France. The issue with uranium, though, is that there are other markets that produce. There are other producers. And so France, for example, has had a strategy of diversifying, not being over-reliant on one supply location, and therefore countries like Kazakhstan, Canada, Australia, and even potentially Namibia, which is the other main producer in Africa, could all kind of step up and fill the void. That's not good news for Niger, because, of course, no exports of uranium from Niger mean even less money for Niger. But I don't think it will impact supplies to civil nuclear projects in Europe, be it the EU or France. There's plenty of uranium to fill that gap.
When we talk about that uranium not getting to places like France and the EU, I don't want to push you to speculate too much here, but are we talking about Niger no longer supplying it by its own choice, or that these countries choose not to accept it anymore?
So it is complicated in Niger because the main minor producer of uranium is Orano, used to be Areva, the French state-controlled company, and so the partnership between France and the Niger junta is deteriorating by the minute as we speak, with the Niger junta now saying that the military arrangements with France are null and void, and France needs to leave. So where does that leave Orano? Nobody can step in quickly to produce uranium, and then again, how are you going to export it? Okay, Niger has opened all its borders except the one with Nigeria now, but this is about disruption of supply chains too. So this is really complicated, and in the short term bodes very poorly for Niger, which again I think is one of the additional reasons for the extra pressure on the junta. They don't have a lot of choices in reality. Solidarity by other putschists to say that they'll support the junta. So the military rulers of Mali and Burkina Faso and Guinea are not going to help the junta in Niamey economically in reality.
We of course shouldn't talk about Niger in isolation, should we? I mean, developments there are the continuation ultimately of a trend right across the Sahel region. I mean, just take a look at this map. This is a map of all the countries that have seen coups just since 2020. And you can see that Niger essentially fills in a gap, creating a chain that stretches unbroken from east to west. So, Alex Vine's a very basic question, but why have we seen so many governments overthrown in the Sahel in just the most recent 3 years?
Yeah, so there's a logic to three of them, which is the one that's just happened in Niger, the one that's happened in Burkina Faso, and the two coups in Mali. The coup that's happened in Guinea is slightly different. It's kind of a counter coup to a constitutional coup, because the previous president tried to change the constitution to run for a third term and was deeply unpopular for that. So that the Niger version is about deteriorating security, a narrative of anti-imperialism, anti-colonialism, and then brazen personal ambition. And so what we just saw a week ago in Niamey with the Niger version is, I think, that the leader of the coup, General Chisan, was going to be booted out of being the head of the presidential guard. And so he decided that was the moment to stage a coup. And now he's trying to envelop himself with other narratives, anti-Western, anti-French, pro-Russian, and so on. What we do have is clearly an arc of instability all the way from the Guinea coast going right through actually to Sudan. There's all these countries. You've got a civil war that's taking place in Sudan. You've got a complicated transition that's going on in Chad. And then we've been talking about what's been going on in Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso and Guinea. So that's that whole arc of instability.
And this was already one of the poorest nations in the world. So what toll has this instability, this political instability, had on the individual economies across the Sahel?
Well, as I say, already a deep UNDP study that was launched a couple of weeks ago on the fringes of the continental body, AU, kind of summit that happened in Kenya, was looking at why do these coups happen and what happens when they happen. And the conclusion is the economies contract. The good news is that there's clearly buyer's remorse. People in these countries recognize actually they don't get what they were hoping the coups would deliver, and the end goal is more accountable government and democracy. And so there's quite a lot of disappointment. This is from over 8,000 interviews. It's a really good report.
Right.
So the reality is that these economies are troubled, some more than others. The landlocked countries find it particularly difficult. I mean, Mali, is a major gold producer, and that there's still gold. There's still continued gold demand. The same with Burkina Faso. Actually, Niger is more vulnerable. It doesn't have gold, and we've discussed uranium. The Guinea coup is different. It has world-class reserves of bauxite, and it also has a coastline. And so it's operating rather differently. Its economy hasn't contracted recently in the way that the others have.
You mentioned how rich the region is in resources like gold, oil, uranium. Have we seen external powers? I mean, I think the answer to this is yes, by the way. But we've seen external powers, trying to secure access to those resources amidst the instability.
Well, I mean, not only France is interested in Niger uranium, the China National Nuclear Corporation is invested in it, 480 million, and oil is important for Niger. So CNPC, the National Oil Company of China, has invested billions actually into a big oil project there. And so you do see, for example, a very principled statement for the return to constitutional order by China, for example. Both through the UN Security Council, but also unilaterally. So there's a lot of interest internationally on stability in this region because of the importance of economics, but also in terms of the fear of overspill of instability into coastal markets and economies that are a lot more important for everybody. Nigeria, Ivory Coast, Ghana, for example.
There's also been a lot of discussion about the role that Russia's Wagner group plays in the region, particularly in areas where there have been coups. Can you just sort of explain to us what the group is doing in the Sahel and how it's tied up with the natural resources there?
Yeah, so good question about Wagner. I mean, their biggest presence in Africa is in just to the north in Libya, and a prime reason for them being there is to protect oil assets. They're also very involved in Mali, providing security, and they've been trying to strike, arrangements where they get rights to protect natural resource endowments, be they gold mines or oil, as in Libya. They've been trying to do the same thing in Burkina Faso, unsuccessfully up to now. But it's very striking that this time last week at the now finished Russia-Africa summit in St. Petersburg, the captain junta leader of Burkina Faso was the one that was most photographed and charmed by Mr. Putin and the Kremlin. So clearly Russia is trying to create a bridgehead into Burkina Faso and get access to the gold mines there through security deals, which is what they're doing elsewhere in Africa, Central African Republic, for example.
Yeah, well, what about in Niger? I mean, Russia has overtly condemned the coup there, but you do have the head of Wagner, Yevgeny Prigozhin, seeming to show an interest in the country. I mean, what do you think? Are we going to see the same story there?
So that's correct. I mean, we've seen a lot of Russian flags brandished by individuals in the demonstrations in Niamey over the last week, although that doesn't necessarily mean strong support for Russia. That's quite easy to hand out some flags. Mr. Prigozhin, on the fringes of the St. Petersburg summit that I mentioned, did make a statement that he would be happy to support the putschists in Niamey and described them as a kind of noble anti-imperial neo-colonial cause. Look, Russia's really contradictory, and I don't fully understand it. So there are even people saying that Mr. Prigozhin isn't as in control of Wagner any longer. So he is the founder of it, but whether he's the leader of it now is also something that's being debated by analysts.
Yeah, well, that's as a result of another attempted coup, right? But this time against the government of Russia.
Exactly, and this could be why you're actually having a stronger, more consistent statement, from Mr. Lavrov, the foreign minister of Russia, twice saying that constitutional order should be restored to Niger, and Russia didn't problematize at all the UN Security Council statement that came out this time last week, saying constitutional rule should be restored, which was unanimous. All members of the Security Council agreed to that. So we'll have to see. There's no doubt that, people calling for Russia to be engaged and Russian flags being brandished in demonstrations is something that's welcomed by Moscow. I mean, that's helpful for the Russian cause. Mm-hmm. But whether they really see an opportunity to go in and replace France and Western partners in Niger, whether they've even got the ability to do that successfully, given everything else that's going on related to the war in Ukraine, I have my doubts. So, time will tell.
Mm-hmm. Obviously, it's not just Wagner in terms of militant groups. They're active in the region. The instability that's been caused in large part by militant Islamist groups in the region has caused particular concern to democracies across Central and Western Africa in particular, and especially to those in the bloc of countries that form part of the Economic Community of West African States, or Ecowas. The most potent tool in ECOWAS's arsenal is its ability to suspend member states from its economic grouping. And Mali, Guinea, Burkina Faso and now Niger have all been suspended following coups in those countries. So Alex Vines, is ECOWAS pressure seen as an effective way of bringing stability to the region?
Well, ECOWAS over the last 15 years has been a lot more feeble in terms of its response. And I think this is why a putschist playbook has developed, that you stage a coup, you hold hostage the president, you release the president after a negotiation and they go into exile. And then you have a transitional process with a timetable ill-defined for eventually some sort of an election, and you even look at whether you can reclothe yourself and run in it. So that's what's been going on. And this time, ECOWAS said enough is enough. They've drawn a line in the sand, and they've put really harsh sanctions on Niger, and they've given an ultimatum for this Sunday for the putschists to step down and restore constitutional order or face an intervention by the regional force. So we're in a different situation now, something we haven't seen in the region for 15 years in reality.
It's amazing, isn't it? Well, we'll see what happens over the weekend, but let's talk in a sort of longer term sense. Is this region where we've seen coup after coup after coup in just such a short period of time, is it stuck in a sort of endless cycle of coups driving down economies and poorly performing economies driving coups?
Well, as I say, there are two types of coup. One is the one that we've been seeing in Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso, which is a mixture of kind of lower level military ambition or a military individual ambition, and believing you can get away with it, mixed with frustration at underperformance of kind of military operations against radical Islamists, for example. A bit of grievance about neo-colonialism, the role of France, all of those, and underperforming economy and corrupt, kind of political elites that there's a sense that they're not delivering. So that's one type of coup. And then the other one is a kind of response to constitutional change that keeps an incumbent in for much longer, and that's the sort of coup that we've seen in Guinea recently. So that I do think that what's happening in Niger is a kind of watershed moment, and so you do have basically a struggle now between the autocracy model and the democracy one. And so you've got more open democracies like Nigeria, Ghana, the Ivory Coast, Cote d'Ivoire, Senegal, all very much allergic to coups, versus kind of the juntas who are advocating strongman autocratic politics. And clearly, my own view is that I hope that the democratic model prevails. I don't see the evidence that these juntas provide enhanced, better security. And the evidence is that actually economies decline and poverty deepens. That's the UNDP analysis of this. We are at a really important potential pivot moment for the region and for the validity in the future of Ecowas being a meaningful regional economic community that has a role in propagating common values, democratic, accountable values.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so a watershed moment in the struggle between democracy and autocracy. Alex Vines, it's been so interesting to have you take us through this and hold our hand and just walk us through it. Thank you so much for joining us. That's Alex Vines, head of the Africa programme at Chatham House. Thanks so much to you for watching as well. If you've enjoyed this, you can find plenty more of our stuff on the DW News YouTube channel. Just look up the business section there, and we'll see you over there.